Gains in muscle mass may explain up to about 65% or more of the variability of strength performance in experienced lifters, proving that hypertrophy is essential for strength performance in the long term. Now, there are countless ways to integrate hypertrophy work in programs for powerlifting. Should I write hypertrophy-specific blocks? Should I spread hypertrophy training across the year? Is doing high reps for squat, bench, and deadlift okay for hypertrophy? So in this video, I want to cut through all of the noise, break down some of the bad ideas that some of you still hold on to today about hypertrophy training for powerlifting, and finally set out some important principles and concepts that you need to effectively integrate hypertrophy work for powerlifting. So without any further ado, let us begin. So if you're new here, my name is Norman Chung. I've been coaching powerlifting for over a decade, and I've worked with lifters up to international standard. So how does hypertrophy matter to powerlifters? Now, when it comes to powerlifting, the ultimate goal is to move the heaviest weight possible in competition. How does muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth play into that? Is bigger always better? Now, hypertrophy obviously refers to the increase in muscle size or cross-sectional area, typically achieved through higher rep training. For powerlifters, it's not just about aesthetics. Now, bigger muscles can mean stronger muscles, but there's going to be more to the story. Now, in the early stages of training, strength gains often come from neural adaptations. In simple terms, biological changes in your nervous system, which ultimately results in a more efficient process to activating those muscle fibers that you already have. Now, this will mean that you can get stronger without seeing much muscle growth in the short term. However, as you become more experienced, hypertrophy becomes increasingly more important. So how does hypertrophy actually contribute to strength? Simply put, more muscle fibers can generate more force. However, size alone isn't the only factor. The arrangement of the muscle fibers, joint mechanics, and how efficiently your nervous system fibers all matter too. And in the grand scheme of things, for powerlifters, how you train will also determine how much work will actually result in stronger lifts. So ultimately, you don't want to train so hard with your hypertrophy work that it holds back your progress in strength performance in the short term, namely through poorly managed fatigue. Now, this is often why powerlifters often periodize their training, focusing on building muscle mass at certain times, then shifting to strength-focused work in other times. This way, they can take advantage of increasing muscle size without sacrificing specific strength adaptations needed for competition performance. Let's move on to the misconceptions and misperceptions of hypertrophy for powerlifters. Now, the first idea is strength training doesn't build muscle. Now, there seems to be this idea that strength training is one thing and building muscle is another thing in a discrete way. But the truth is that they're different in terms of goals. But the thing is, when you do train for strength, you are inevitably going to be building muscle. If you were to build a program that exclusively only has the squat, bench, and deadlift movements, and you designed it to optimize for strength gains, chances are that over one period to the next, you're likely going to get increases in muscle mass as well. And in the same way, if you did a pure bodybuilding program, chances are from one period to the next, you're likely going to find that you will get stronger as well. So the thing that you want to take away from this is that if you are doing a considerable amount of work in your squat, bench, and deadlift, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to add more separate hypertrophy training for those specific prime movers of those lifts, namely your quads, your glutes, chest, and triceps, and so on and so forth. And the second idea is the idea of the hypertrophy block. Now, there is this very old idea that in order to increase muscle mass for powerlifters, they need to perform a hypertrophy-specific training block. Now, that's not necessarily to say that there isn't a valid use for a training block that's a bit more biased towards hypertrophy. For the majority of the year, it's probably more ideal that hypertrophy training is integrated and woven into the fabric of a regular strength development block. Some powerlifters include a dedicated hypertrophy block in the training. While this will build muscle, the flaw is isolating hypertrophy phases too distinctly from strength phases, potentially losing strength-specific adaptations in the process. And you might not necessarily see that when it comes to a less experienced lifter, because doing more training is going to get them more progress ultimately. The thing to keep in mind is that for any given period of time, there is an optimal training dose that is A, upholding the strength that the powerlifter is currently holding, and B, stimulating the powerlifter to get stronger across that time period. And if you move the powerlifter away from this optimal stimulus range, these adaptations may get lost if a hypertrophy-only phase gets used, ultimately due to the loss of exposure to that higher-end intensity as a stimulus. And the other thing to also realize is that increasing in muscle mass is a slow process, and the amount of extra hypertrophy that you gain from a hypertrophy-specific block that gets run between 4 to 6 weeks probably isn't worth the sacrifice in actual strength performance. Having said that, there are probably periods of time when a hypertrophy-biased block may have its utility, which I will reveal later on. Now, there's also this idea that powerlifters need hypertrophy in very specific areas that is different to a bodybuilder. And so consequentially, there's this idea that powerlifters should do high rep sets for the SBD as hypertrophy work, which I think is a flawed way of going about hypertrophy training for powerlifters. So there are 3 problems with this. First one is that the squat, bench and deadlift movements are not optimal for any single muscle group. Second one is that you may run into overuse issues or reduced mobility from too much specificity. And the third one is burnout and boredom. Now, with the first problem, you want hypertrophy in the prime movers of your squat, bench and deadlift. And yes, the squat, bench and deadlift are movements that can and will increase muscle mass in those muscle groups. But the problem is, in my opinion, is that you can probably apply physics and biomechanics to come up with better exercises to target individual constituent muscle groups more optimally and get more emphasis on regional hypertrophy. For example, you can probably use the leg press or the leg extensions to push the quad muscles closer towards failure safer. And you can probably use a single leg seated leg press or split squats to equalize the stimulus on each side of your body. For the second problem, in my opinion again, if you were to only use a smaller number of movements specifically to drive hypertrophy, it's going to be easier to run into overuse issues driving the same movement pattern over and over again, potentially resulting in loss of movement options or mobility, which may or may not impact your ability to continue to squat, bench and deadlift. And the third problem, I think it's going to simply make more people burn out and get bored of the training process. Now, from a movement perspective, SBD are generally very repetitive movements, and so it's going to make the process more enjoyable if there are a wider range of exercises to add to the important long-term qualities needed, as well as also provide a novel stimulus. And the next bad idea is the idea of the 2-to-1 ratio of pull and push training. Now, there is this very old idea, again, to balance out push and pull exercises for shoulder health, typically recommending 2 pulling movements or sets for every single pushing movement or set. And this is an idea that's not just existed in the bodybuilding and fitness industry, but also within the powerlifting industry as well. And I think the philosophy of this recommendation has good intentions, but it's fundamentally flawed. I think hard evidence is lacking for the idea of a 2-to-1 ratio of pull and push to prevent or reduce risk of shoulder injury. And I think ultimately this 2-to-1 ratio is a bit arbitrary as well. And I think it's one of those anecdotes to encourage people not to neglect their back training, which seem to have stuck around a little bit longer than necessary. Now, just because I don't think a 2-to-1 ratio of pull and push volume has solid grounding doesn't mean that I think you should necessarily do more or less of it. So I do think that powerlifters need to prioritize their pushing, namely their bench press and pushing accessories, because ultimately this is what they want to be good at, and then do enough pulling for them to continuously make progress in building up a stronger and bigger back. I think fundamentally, if you are going to specialize in a sport, it probably makes sense that the whole program will inevitably bias those movements more. Also, from a shoulder mobility health perspective, on top of pulling movements, I do think powerlifters can benefit more from reaching movements as well, where there is a bit more emphasis on protractions such as cable flies, push-ups, landmine press, etc. Because actually, if you think about the positions you're in when you come to do a bench press and a lot of other pulling movements, you do actually drive retraction and extension through your posterior chain a lot. So the next flawed idea is the idea of symmetry of sets between muscle groups. Now, the concept here is that all muscle groups should receive equal sets to have a balanced development. Now, I think this is a misconception that is similar to the last point of the 2-to-1 ratio of pull to push movements. I think this is largely driven by some sort of human bias towards things to be all in perfect harmony and balance.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
I also think that this is probably a combination of confusing the goals of bodybuilding training, where a lot of powerlifters actually came from, where the physique has to be even, with the goals of powerlifting, which is actually to specialize in performing in 3 lifts, the squat, bench and deadlift. Now, due to the asymmetries in goals, it's inevitable that we must sacrifice that which we do not need as much for that we need more of. So let's actually dive in and talk about how we can integrate hypertrophy training in powerlifting programs. So the first thing that I think you should do is consider setting goals to target short-term weaknesses and long-term athlete development. Setting goals are important when figuring out what to do, because ultimately, if you don't have a goal, then you're going to be unsure of what you need to actually put into the program or what you need to prioritize. And you also need to combine that with considering what can be done. So when it comes to priorities, you need to focus on those short-term weaknesses first. So if there are lagging muscle groups or like muscle groups that lack a bit more work capacity, those muscles need to be targeted first. And if there is space within the training program, or if there aren't that many weaknesses at this point in time, then you can consider having a more holistic approach to building hypertrophy across all of the muscle groups of the whole body. Now, if you look at higher level lifters, generally speaking, elite lifters will often have physiques that are not too dissimilar to bodybuilders, where they generally have quite an even build across their whole body. So in terms of where you actually place those exercises of those muscle groups, you want to consider the space between the training days. So if there is a rest day between day 1 and day 2 is when you have your primary squat day, you may want to include some quad hypertrophy work on day 1. But ultimately, you do want to consider the magnitude of the stimulus and the impact on subsequent training days. So sometimes what people need is a little bit of hypertrophy work to actually feel strong on those primary days. But sometimes those hypertrophy days can actually fatigue those muscle groups for those lifters. And so in order to really find that out, you kind of do need to pay attention to how the athlete feels and actually monitoring what happens when you put things in and take things out. However, if you are dealing with an athlete that generally doesn't have that much work capacity, you may want to consider spreading out the frequency of how often those muscle groups are trained. And the next thing that I think you guys should do is to consider using principles to optimize for hypertrophy. So as a general rule of thumb, I like to encourage using exercises that train muscle groups at long muscle lengths, because I think if you look at the training literature, generally there seems to be of evidence to support the idea that training muscle groups at longer muscle lengths seems to elicit and bring about a little bit more muscle mass. You also want to consider using external stabilization in certain exercises. So, when you perform an exercise, there are 2 things that you can think about. So you can think about force production, just putting a lot of effort into squeezing that muscle. The other thing is focusing a lot more on coordination, right? So if you focus on externally stabilizing yourself in the environment of the exercise, for example, using a machine or holding onto a pole or something like that, then you can actually prioritize putting a little bit more effort and just pushing that muscle group closer towards failure, which can be a little bit more optimal if you want to optimize for hypertrophy. So you also want to use a close enough proximity towards failure. And the reason why this is important is because the closer towards failure that you get, the more likely that you're going to activate those high threshold motor units, which are associated with the type 2 muscle fibers, which ultimately is responsible for more of your strength and size gain. This is called the Henneman size principle. So the next advice I would also recommend when it comes to integrating hypertrophy work is considering leveraging enjoyable exercises. If you communicate with the athlete well, you're going to find out what exercises that athletes generally prefer. Now, if you leverage enjoyable exercises that the athletes have a preference to, so there's a few things that actually happens. First one is that you actually reduce the chances of the athletes actually skipping the exercises. Secondly, they're more likely to adhere to the program and actually buy into your process, because their process is a lot more enjoyable. And thirdly, they're more likely to actually concentrate on executing well on those exercises, which probably will snowball into better gains in the long term. So if an athlete opens up a program and they see that the accessory exercises or hypertrophy exercises are all 3 sets of 10, and the chances are that the athlete will spot a bit of laziness from your half. Having a bit of more intention in thinking about, whether certain exercises will probably be better off with lower reps or higher reps, or having a slightly different rep protocol may make the program look a little bit more complex, but actually it may stimulate the athlete to actually pay a little bit more attention on executing. And so after the main lifts, it gives the athletes another thing to actually aim for when it comes to training. And also when it comes to setting goals and seeing progressions, seeing progress in certain accessories is also going to help motivate the athlete as well. So that extra bit of effort on thinking about the rep scheme and prescriptions of your hypertrophy work and setting goals for it is going to go a long way when it comes to athlete enjoyability. So the next advice is considering the strength curve of those hypertrophy exercises. When it comes to different exercises, whether it's performed with a cable machine, resistance machine, or free weights, they are also going to come with a strength curve within that range of motion. And so what that means is that there is going to be a certain profile where tension seems to be higher in certain ranges of motion, and they're going to be less in other ranges of motion. So how can you use this when it comes to choosing exercises? If you want to just focus on optimizing for hypertrophy, then you may want to choose exercises where the tension is highest when the muscle length is longest. You may also want to consider the weaknesses of the athlete. So let's say, for example, the athlete seems to struggle at the bottom end of the bench press. And so you may end up considering choosing a chest exercise where there is maximal tension when the pec is most stretched out. If you have a situation where the athlete is chronically sore or they're experiencing discomfort within certain ranges of motion at a joint, then you may want to choose an exercise where there is higher tension when the muscle group is at a different point to where the discomfort is. So for example, let's say an athlete is going through training where the pec, when it's most stretched out, seems to cause a bit of discomfort, then you may want to choose an exercise where tension is highest during the shorter range of motion or shorter muscle length of the pec fibers. Also, if you are dealing with an athlete who has mobility issues because they're generally very tight, then you may want to consider choosing exercises where they tend to load through a longer muscle length in the exercise. So the next thing that you want to consider when integrating hypertrophy work for powerlifters is periodizing rep ranges. So there is a very small amount of research that seems to suggest that there is a potential observation that different rep ranges actually cause slight differences in regional hypertrophy of a muscle group. So the other thing about periodizing the rep ranges is that it can create a bit of a psychological novel stimulus for people, and this can keep the athlete a little bit more engaged during those exercises. So the other thing about periodizing the rep ranges is that if you are dealing with an athlete that is feeling a little bit overused in certain muscle groups, you may not necessarily want to choose low reps because you may end up using slightly high intensity sets. But having said that, you could easily just reduce the RPE to a very, very low amount. Alternatively, you could consider using higher reps, where ultimately you end up playing around with much lower intensity reps, where the majority of those reps are not going to be that individually stimulating. Now, the other thing to think about when it comes to proximity to failure with different rep ranges is that if you do want to think about optimizing for hypertrophy, if you are dealing with lower reps, you probably don't need to be that close to failure. So you can probably get away with keeping a 2 to 3 rep in reserve for those sort of low rep sets. However, if you are dealing with higher rep sets, then you may want to consider going towards failure or close to failure. So 1 to no reps left in reserve. So when it comes to programming training with the prime movers in mind, it's probably a bit more useful to introduce them somewhat a little bit more conservatively if they do need a bit more additional work. So when it comes to increasing the amount of volume that you work on a muscle group, I would recommend starting with 1 to 2 hard sets at a time. You also want to consider where they are located in a week and see how those subsequent training sessions respond to that additional volume. If you are creating a new program for a new lifter with training history, so you ultimately want to consider how well they're already currently doing in terms of recovery with the previous training that they were doing. If they generally find training to be very easy and they've sort of plateaued, and you want to ask yourself if they need a little bit more development from hypertrophy work, then you may want to consider adding more. And if they haven't plateaued and they're generally progressing quite well, then you may want to consider keeping the levels quite similar. If they were coming from a place where they were never really feeling that fresh, they were always a little bit more fatigued, and they were sort of plateauing, you want to look at how much work they were doing for hypertrophy on those prime movers. And if they seem to be doing a lot, then you may want to consider reducing those volumes. And the next advice with integrating hypertrophy work for powerlifters is considering how much hypertrophy work is important for maintaining the strength. And so, yes, training does provide a stimulus, but it also provides fatigue. And sometimes it's not obvious whether they actually need that hypertrophy work in order to keep their strength levels up. And so this is something that I recommend a lot of coaches to actually experiment with in the off season, where you sort of take the accessory work away to see what happens within their strength levels. So when it comes to moving towards the peak and taper, coaches are going to have a more of an educated guess on whether to actually take away or keep in the hypertrophy work for those prime movers. And the key thing to ultimately remember is that when it comes to tapering, that doesn't mean that everything needs to be reduced. So I hope you guys found this useful. If you found this useful, please click like and subscribe. And if there's any other videos that you guys want me to make, please comment in the box below, and I'll see you guys on the next one.